Hey everyone, what is happening? So I hope everyone had a great weekend and that you obviously social distanced and that we're all doing well. All right, so we're going to be connecting the ovarian cycle to the uterine cycle and we're going to explain how the ovarian cycle affects the uterine cycle. So what we're going to do over here, so we've got the ovarian cycle, and remember this is the ovary. And so if we just draw a little ovary right here, so this is our ovary, and we're going to have our little egg and with the follicle, and it's going to do some stuff, and we're going to see that in a second. And over here we have our uterine cycle, and this is all taking place in the uterus. All right, so let's start with the ovarian cycle, and we're going to start with the follicular phase. Is day 1 to 13, and FSH is sent out from the anterior pituitary, and remember that the hypothalamus is sending out gonadotropin releasing hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH. So we've got FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and this stimulates the follicle to mature. As we can see right here, and I'll just put a highlighter, it'd be right there. That's day 1. And as we get more and more FSH, it starts to build up, and we get a bigger follicle, and we get more granulosa cells. Remember, this is a primary oocyte, and then it turns into a Graafian follicle, which is just more developed. It's also producing more and more estrogen. The follicle, FSH stimulates the follicle to mature, and then estrogen is released. And remember, there's a few things that estrogen does. So estrogen causes increased cell division in the granulosa cells. So this in turn increases estrogen. Estrogen also thickens the endometrium, and it also helps secondary sex characteristics develop. So that's breast and fat development. So that's our first thing. So that's day 1 to 13 in the follicular phase. All right, so how does that affect the uterine cycle? Well, as we have at the very beginning of our cycle here, is there's actually not that much estrogen at the very beginning. And so what happens is we actually get a decrease. So what happens is this lack of estrogen, so we've got day 1 to 5, and this is the menstrual phase. And so the lack of estrogen, because the follicle is just very small and not producing as much estrogen, so it doesn't support the endometrium, so it is shed. Now remember that if we will look back at the end of this and see that the corpus luteum was producing progesterone and estrogen, and that's what helped build up that endometrial lining. As soon as the corpus luteum starts to degrade because someone is not pregnant, then that lack of estrogen and progesterone causes the endometrium to be shed. So we get the lack of estrogen and progesterone causes the endometrium to shed. And this LH reduction causes a decrease in E and P. So this brings us now to the proliferative phase. And so the second part here is we have day 6 to 14, and this is the proliferative phase. And so what we have is, because those granulosa cells are getting bigger and there's more of them, they're producing more and more estrogen. So what we get is estrogen thickens the endometrium. And so you can see how the follicular phase is now affecting the uterus, or how it's connecting. So if we go down just a little bit here, on day 14, oh, by the way, just a quick here is when we get that spike in estrogen, it causes it. When we get past that threshold, it causes a spike in LH, and this is when we get ovulation. So on day 14, we get ovulation, and we'll just write this in: due to increased E and spike in LH. Now remember, if you look back at last time's video, that spike in estrogen is a positive feedback loop originally. All right, And what happens is that once it gets past a threshold, it turns on the anterior pituitary to push out more or to release more LH, and that causes the follicle to burst. What we have is LH, luteinizing hormone, causes the Graafian follicle, which is a mature follicle, to burst. And what this does is we release the egg into the fallopian tube. So egg is released into fallopian tube. So this has no effect on the uterus at the moment. It just goes into the fallopian tube and gets ready to hopefully be fertilized. So the next part we have is day 15 to 28. Now this could be shorter, it can be longer. That follicular phase up to ovulation is always 14 days no matter what. If a person's cycle is shorter or longer, it all is based on the luteal phase and how much estrogen and progesterone the corpus luteum is producing. So this 15 to 28 day part is the luteal phase. And if you remember, you just go back up to here, the luteal phase, we're going to draw this in and the follicle will burst, that little egg will come out. And then what we're talking about with the luteal phase is the corpus luteum, and it's going to start to produce estrogen and progesterone. And what that does, and we're going to talk about this in a second, it's going to support the uterus. And it starts big, and then it gets smaller and smaller until there's not enough estrogen and progesterone, and that's when we get back to the beginning of the cycle. All right, so just going back to the luteal phase here, the LH has caused the Graafian follicle to burst, and the egg is let out. All right, and so this results, so the corpus luteum is the remaining follicle, and the corpus luteum, it releases smaller amounts of estrogen and large amounts of progesterone. Now, what this does, this progesterone causes the endometrium to increase in blood vessels and mucosal secretions. And so let's come over to here now. Just go back up to over here. We'll put it right here, and we've got day 15 to 28. And this is called the secretory phase. And we just talked about that with the mucosal secretions. So we've got the secretory phase. And so remember that the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. So we're talking about how the ovary is actually affecting the uterus. And so the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. And like I just said, we've got increased vascularization and mucus. And all this is therefore to make sure that if there was fertilization right around ovulation, that the uterus is going to be really, really good for egg or embryo development. So what we can see, let's just recap what we did. Okay, so we started with the ovarian cycle, and we're looking at how it affects the uterine cycle. So the first part was we had the follicular phase. This is the follicle developing, and this is due to an increased levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone, which in turn causes follicle stimulating hormone to stimulate the follicle to mature. That follicle, which we can see here and here and here, it develops and develops and develops. It releases estrogen, which not only makes it grow, but it also makes the endometrium get thicker. Now, just to go back right over to here, at the very beginning, there's not enough estrogen and progesterone, and so the endometrium is shed. Now, once we get past a certain threshold, and I'm just going to show you this threshold here, what I'm talking about here is you can see that the estrogen is building up, and this is because, and we saw this picture last day, is because we have levels of FSH. And now that follicle is getting bigger and bigger, we get more and more estrogen, and that estrogen surge causes a peak in LH, and that LH causes the follicle to burst. And so now on day 14, we get ovulation, and that egg is going to be taken in by the fimbriae and into the fallopian tube, where it may or may not be fertilized. Now, after that, L8, after that, we get into the luteal phase, day 15 to 28. The corpus luteum is remaining, and what it does is it releases estrogen, and it also releases a lot of progesterone. And you can see that right here. So we've got a little bit, we've still got a bit of estrogen, and then we've got a lot of progesterone. And those are all causing the endometrium to get thicker and be ready for implantation. That's from day 15 to 28. Now, as it gets smaller and smaller, estrogen and progesterone goes down, and we get all the way back to our menstrual phase. All right. Well, I hope that helps, and we will have a chat about this today or tomorrow. All right. Take care.